kingdom. And by way of introduction, looking at some of this material, there'll be some things that you kind of have to look at closely that almost seem contradictory, but they're not. But looking at the top or the beginning of the lesson, it says, unfortunately, many of the preachers and teachers of the 20th century have emphasized the church, but have given little attention to the kingdom. And this has led to a misunderstanding of both the church and the kingdom, and has led some Bible students to declare that they are one and the same. It is true that they are very similar in nature and closely related, but they are not the same. Now, that statement is just not true in its entirety. The church and the kingdom are the same, depending on the way that you use the terminology. Now look at the next line, because that kind of unsettled me as I was looking at this. It says, the word church and the word kingdom cannot, what's the next line? What's the next word? Always. They cannot always be used interchangeably. This confusion has resulted from a failure to identify them as two separate things. Now, just by way of note, the word always, they can't always be used interchangeably, but they can sometimes be used interchangeably. And so his opening statement is not correct in light of what he says in his second statement. I mean, not that it's a huge issue, but it would be confusing, especially in light of a lot of the misunderstandings that are present about the church and the kingdom and the religious world at large. I think there is some, I don't know if misunderstanding is the right word. I think there might be a little bit of confusion with regard to the church and the kingdom. And it's been a number of years ago that I had done some reading. David Burleson had written a book that my first introduction to him and his work. He had written a book called Will the Real Heretics Please Stand Up? And in that book, he showed 5 primary doctrines believed by the early church that are not believed by the religious world at large today. And he was talking about doing some teaching. Hey, Candy, how you doing? Hey, Shannon, will you get her? He'd done some teaching on the church and the kingdom, and I was researching, and he's a great Bible student. And he talked about how most of the religious world today doesn't believe what we can know that the early church believed, even from the writings of the fathers that lived immediately after the apostles. And so, and doing some more work along those lines, along some of his teaching on the kingdom, he made the same kind of statement that Stroop made, that the church and the kingdom are not the same. And he says you can't use them interchangeably. And he just kind of cherry-picked some verses, and he cherry-picked some verses and substituted the word church for kingdom and the word kingdom for church. And obviously it ended up being ridiculous. But he missed the overall point. In other words, he tried to say too much. He tried to make it say too much. The church and the kingdom are the same. Again, depending on what use you're making of the word kingdom. And there are at least 2 or 3 different ways the New Testament uses the word kingdom. And so I wanted to make it a point of emphasis. They can't always be used interchangeably, but in some senses they can be used interchangeably. And there's some things I want us to think about with regard to the church and the kingdom. And Stroop will admit that they can be used interchangeably at some point later in the lesson, but not always. But I want to note something as he's going to introduce this material from the viewpoint of the word kingdom, and how is the word kingdom used in the New Testament sense of the word, insofar as we speak of the preaching of John the Baptist, the preaching of Jesus, the early teaching of Jesus, and then some of the early preaching of the apostles, but I think he misses something that I'll share with you in just a little bit. But he talks about at the bottom of page 54, where it says lesson 5, says these observations seem to be in order. The word kingdom is commonly used to designate a territory or domain over which a king rules or reigns. Therefore, the use of the word kingdom implies the presence of a king, and the use of the word king indicates the existence of a kingdom. Also, the use of the word throne suggests the presence of a kingdom and a king. And that's exactly right. For a kingdom to exist, there has to be defined boundaries. Defined boundaries. There has to be a king. There has to be a law. There has to be subjects in that kingdom. And where Scripture is really going with this is that the church consists of the subjects of the kingdom and not necessarily the kingdom itself. Now that is true, but again, I don't think it paints the entire picture or a totally accurate picture of how the two relate to one another. It says the Bible does not provide us with an analytical description of the kingdom, just as it does not furnish us with a detailed picture of the church. Again, I might take issue with that. It says, but it will be necessary for us to derive the true concept of the kingdom from the use of the word in the Bible, as we have in the case of the church. Now he does make this point. He says the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, and the kingdom of Christ may be used interchangeably. Well, a friend of mine just said the mic's not working, so I'm going to unplug this mic and see if we can make the other mic work. Thank you, Tony. He's in Arkansas. It says the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, and the kingdom of Christ may be used interchangeably, and that, of course, is also true. Now, he talks about the use of the term kingdom on page 55, but I also want to go over to page 56. As he speaks about the kingdom, there was a kingdom in the Old Testament that did not have an earthly king, the kingdom of Israel. But it did have a king. It just was not an earthly king. It was a spiritual king. And God was the king over Israel. And then we get to 1 Samuel chapter 8, where the people of God say, give us a king, that we might be like the nations round about us. And so Samuel is distraught over this matter. And he pleads with God, he pleads with the people, and in his exchange with God, God assures him. Now, of course, one of the reasons that they demanded a king was because Samuel had done a sorry job of raising his kids. I mean, Eli had done a sorry job of raising his kids, and Phineas and was it Eleazar was his other son, and they were about as sorry as the day is long. And then Samuel raised his kids, and they were sorry. And so the people used his kids as an excuse to get a king. It says, your sons do not walk in your ways. In other words, Samuel, we'll follow you. But we know that when you're gone, your sons don't follow in your ways, which, by the way, was not a necessity for them to have a judge, because Samuel was not the child of Eli. The judges weren't handed down. The judges weren't handed down from father to son. They were raised up as God wanted them, and the people needed them. And so God could have raised up any judge. Any good man could have been raised up to have been a judge after Samuel's death. But the people used his kids, his sons, as an excuse to get what they really wanted. And that teaches us a lesson, I think, just kind of as an aside, that a lot of times when people say certain things, they don't really use the true reason behind what their intent is. The people wanted a king. All right? Well, what excuse can we make to get us a king? Samuel's kids are sorry, and we don't want them to serve as judges. So we're going to hold up that's going to be our reason, but it's really not a reason at all. And people still do the same. People still do the same thing today. But we note that in the giving of a king, and by the way, let me just mention this, I got off track, that God told Samuel, look, they haven't rejected you. He says, they've rejected me, that I should not rule over them. But note you can note in the text, especially down at the bottom of page 56, it says, God told Samuel to give the people a king, but he did not relinquish his rule over them. In other words, whether or not they had a king, God was still going to be in charge. And then you look at the statement that Samuel makes to the people on behalf of the Lord beginning at the bottom of page 56. It's from 1 Samuel chapter 12. It says, if you will fear Jehovah and serve him and hearken unto his voice and not rebel against the commandment of Jehovah, and both ye and also the king that reigneth over you be followers of Jehovah. See, you and your king have to be followers of Jehovah. Then that will be well. But if you do not hearken to the voice of Jehovah, but rebel against the commandment of Jehovah, then the hand of Jehovah will be against you, as it was against your fathers. And so God says, all right, you're going to have your king, but I'm still in charge. In other words, your success, your prosperity as a nation does not rest on your king. Your prosperity and your success still rests on me. And as long as you and your king do what's right, I'll prosper you. But the moment you and your king quit following me, you're done. Because when it says the hand of the Lord will be against you, who's strong enough to fight against the hand of the Lord? And so Samuel makes it clear that even though they're going to take on an earthly king, that God is still the one who reigns over that kingdom. And then you get down to the middle of page 57, and you see with regard to David, after Saul was a miserable failure as king, that David was anointed, and then God established David's lineage as the eternal lineage of all the kings that would follow, all the way up to the Messiah. So Saul was a Benjaminite. He was the first king. But David was from the tribe of Judah. And that's what Israel spoke of when he blessed his sons in Genesis 49. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. That's the tribe of David. That was the tribe of the kings thereafter. And it's the tribe of the Lord Jesus Christ. And then you see in the middle of page 57 that this kingdom was rent asunder because of the sins of Solomon. Now, a lot of times we think about the kingdom being rent asunder because of the foolishness of Rehoboam. Remember when Solomon died, Rehoboam became king. And he was trying to get some ideas on how he ought to reign in the kingdom. And he inquired of the older men. He said, what should I do? They said, your father put a heavy burden on us, tax-wise. We were heavily taxed under your father to build that temple and to build his house and to build up all these things. If you're smart, you'll ease the tax burden on the people. And if you do that, they'll follow you forever. And then he went and he talked to his young friends. And his young friends said, you go tell them, if you think my father placed a heavy burden on you, he says, my little finger will be like my father's thigh. In other words, if you think you had it bad under him, I'm really going to be hard on him. And then he listened to those knuckleheads, and the people decided they'd rebel, and they did. But the ultimate cause of that rebellion was all the way back in the days of Solomon, when Solomon disobeyed the Lord. And he took wives of the women of the people of Canaan that the Lord had forbidden them to take. And he had 700 wives, 300 concubines. The Bible says that they turned his heart from serving the Lord, and he was not faithful as his father David was. And in 1 Kings 11 and verses 11 through about 13, the word of the Lord comes to Solomon and says, because you've not been faithful to serve me like your father David, I'm going to take the kingdom and tear it away from you. He says, but I'm not going to do it while you're alive because of your father David's sake. But after you're dead, the kingdom will be divided. And it was. 10 tribes went to the north, followed after Jeroboam, and then the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained, and the nation became known as Judah, and they followed after Rehoboam and his descendants. It should be noted that there was never, ever a faithful king in the days of the nation of Israel. Once the kingdom divided, there were 19 kings in Israel, and of none of them is it ever said, he did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. Now, many of the kings of Judah were also wicked kings. But of a select few, it was said of them, they did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. Like, for example, like Hezekiah or Josiah. And so there were some good kings in Judah, but there were never any good kings in Israel. And so there's the establishment of the kingdom and the concept in the Jewish mind, again, in the Jewish mind of the kingdom. And so when the New Testament rolls around and the preaching of John and the preaching of Jesus comes into play, and the preaching of the apostles and the preaching of the 70 in the limited commission, there is a recurring theme over and over and over and over again that they preached about the kingdom. We don't have any reference whatsoever in the gospel accounts of anybody talking about preaching about the church. Now here's where I think Stroop kind of overstated his point and he missed something. All right? Let me give you an example. The word church. Now let me do this, the word kingdom. The word kingdom is found 158 times in the New Testament. The word kingdom is found 158 times in the New Testament. All of them, except for 31, are found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So 127 times when the word kingdom is found, 127 out of 158 are found in the gospel accounts. Only 31 are found in the epistles and in the book of Revelation. Now that's every use of the word kingdom, regardless of how it's being used, okay? But we see a mighty emphasis on kingdom preaching in the Gospels. Now, the word church or churches appears 110 times in the New Testament. Of those 110 times, only 3 times do we find the word church in the gospel accounts. The word church is only found 3 times in the gospel accounts. It's found in Matthew 16 and verse 18, upon this rock I'll build my church. And it's found twice in Matthew 18 concerning the matter of church discipline. If he will not hear those witnesses, tell it to the church. And if he will not hear the church, let him be unto you as a heathen and a tax collector. That is the entirety of the use of the word church in the gospel accounts. So you know what that means? Mark never mentioned the church. Luke never mentioned the church. And John never mentioned the church. So that means 107 times after the book of John, 107 times out of 110, the word church is found beginning in the book of Acts going forward. Now let's think about that for a minute. Let's just think about that for a minute. Why would the preaching of the kingdom be so important in Matthew through John and not the preaching of the church? Why would the preaching of the kingdom be so important in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and not the preaching of the church? Let me ask you a question. Is the church prophesied of in the Old Testament?
Well, I thought it was.
Well, perhaps in a technical sense it might be, but did any of the prophets ever talk about a church coming?
No, not the church.
Not one time. Not one time do you ever see the prophets talking about there's a church coming. What did they say is coming? A kingdom is coming, and also a what?
Draw all nations unto it.
No. In addition to the kingdom, what else were they supposed to be looking for? A king. They're supposed to be looking for a king in order to establish that kingdom that's been prophesied over and over and again. I'm not saying that you can't find the church in the Old Testament. My point is, the prophets pointed to a kingdom, and the prophets pointed to a king. Now, what kind of people would have been familiar with the writing of the Old Testament and the prophets? Jews. Who was almost the exclusive recipient of the preaching in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Jews. Very few non-Jews were preached to in the days of the ministry of Jesus. When Jesus sent out those 70 and he sent out the 12, who did he tell them to preach to?
Children of Israel.
The lost sheep of the house of Israel. Who are those? Jews. And he expressly forbid them from going into the cities of Gentiles and the Samaritans. And so, my point is, the audience of the preaching of the gospel, when I say the preaching of the Gospels, I mean the preaching in the Gospels. The audience of the preaching in the Gospels is a Jewish audience. And they're looking for a kingdom, and they're looking for a king. Now, which one did they need to look for first? King. They had to find a king before they could find the kingdom, right? Now, from the earliest days of the work of John and the work of Jesus, well, let me just open your Bibles to John chapter 1. Open your Bibles to John chapter 1. Look in verse number 45. No, 41, I'm sorry. This is Andrew goes and finds Simon, and he says, "We have found a what or a who? A who? We found the Messiah, which being interpreted or translated as what? The Christ, which means what? What's the word Christ mean? What's it mean? It's anointed one. Right. He's an anointed one. Now you go to verse 45. Philip finds Nathanael and said, we have found a what or a who? A who? We have found him, of whom Moses and the prophets did in the law did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Now go down to verse 45 when Jesus is talking to Nathanael. When Jesus said, before Philip called you, I saw you under a tree. It's like, how do you know me? He said, I saw you under a tree. What's his declaration? And what's his declaration about Jesus, verse 49? You're the Son of God, and you're the what? The King of Israel. So they're looking for a king. And they're looking for a king in order to establish a kingdom. Right? Looking for a king in order to establish a kingdom. And so the preaching of the kingdom was paramount in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because the people to whom that message was preached were not looking for a church, they were looking for a king and looking for a kingdom. That's why we find 127 out of 158 uses of the word kingdom in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
But it would have took some perspective for the Jews to even understand what church was, considering what the kingdom was a reference. If the kingdom was a reference to the church, and they had no idea what that kingdom would consist of. That's, I believe, why they have so much problem still today. Because even though at the time they recognized the king, they had the wrong idea of the kingdom.
That's exactly right. And that's what I was talking about a week or so ago with Shapiro. He's a hardcore Jew. And he still believes that all the Jewish scholars are right about the nature of the Messiah and the nature of the kingdom. And William Lane Craig is trying to say, no, they were wrong, and the resurrection of Jesus from the dead shows they were wrong. Now, now you heard what Kyle said. The nature of the church would have been just unthinkable to the Jews. All they could think about of themselves was in terms of a kingdom, right? With a king, a ruler, a nation, a nation. And so this preaching of the kingdom. Now, question: When did they get it? In other words, when did the Jews understand the nature of the kingdom and the church? When?
Probably when Paul started preaching.
When did the Jews get it? When did the apostles get it? Say it, Steph. Acts 2. Acts 2 is when they got it. You know why I know it has to be Acts 2? Because they still didn't get it in Acts 1. They still didn't get it in Acts 1. Jesus has been preaching the kingdom. Right? The triumphal entry of Christ into the city of Jerusalem. The people cried, Hosanna in the highest. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And then they make a direct citation to the coming of the kingdom. So all the people think that Jesus is going to usher in the kingdom. And they were right, but they were wrong. They were right in that he was going to usher in the kingdom. They were wrong about the nature of the kingdom. Now, Jesus dies. He's buried. He's raised again. He spends 40 days appearing to people, including the apostles. And on the very precipice is not the right word because that's kind of falling off, but on the very day that he's fixing to be ascended into heaven, after 40 days after his resurrection, what question question did his apostles ask? What is the first question we see his apostles ask him in Acts chapter 1? What is it? Will you at this time? Can somebody finish it from there? Apparently not. Will you at this time restore the nation unto Israel? So what are they asking?
They're going to establish his kingdom.
Are you going to establish your kingdom now? What kind of kingdom they hunting? Earthly kingdom. So, even the apostles, all the way up to Acts chapter 1, didn't get it. They didn't get it for another 10 days. Because on the day of Pentecost, or at least 10 days, on the day of Pentecost, then they understood. Let me ask you a question. Did they preach Jesus as a king in Acts chapter 2? God has made this same Jesus whom you have crucified both what? Lord and Christ, or Lord and King. He's preached as the king in Acts chapter 2. Now, from that time forward, we see an incredible increase in the use of the word church or assembly, and a decrease in the use of the word kingdom. But not altogether giving it up. For example, in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 13, the Bible says, Paul says to the Colossians they were saved individuals, they were members of the church, he said, God has translated us out of darkness and into the kingdom of his dear Son. So he's talking to people who are members of the church and says to them at that time, you have been taken out of darkness and placed into the kingdom. So in that case, we know for a fact that church and kingdom can be used interchangeably, right? Those terms can be used interchangeably in that sense. But see, where I think Stroop missed it was, I think he missed it in regard to, he tried to separate the church from the kingdom so much in his argumentation that I think he missed the overall point, which was who was the audience? Who was the audience of this kingdom preaching? Because once we get past say, Acts 10. By the way, what's special about Acts 10? The Gentiles have the gospel preached to them, right? Alright, question. What do the Gentiles know about the kingdom? No. Preaching the kingdom to the Gentiles is not nearly as important as preaching the kingdom to the Jews. So once you start in with the epistles, you start finding a blend of the preaching of the kingdom and the preaching about the church, and you start seeing those things used interchangeably. That people were a member of the kingdom, they were a member of the church. Now, to kind of set us up for next week, there is still yet another kingdom that we are not yet members of. Remember when I said the word kingdom is going to be used at least 3 different ways? It's going to refer to earthly kingdoms, it's going to refer to the church, and it's going to refer to heaven. That's right, heaven. And so there were kingdom members who still yet had another kingdom that lay ahead. By the way, Acts 14:22 is probably about where we will start that, Lord willing, next week. But I just kind of want to lay a foundation of how we're going to use the terminology moving forward. It's not correct to say the church and the kingdom are not the same in every sense, or it's correct to say they're not the same in every sense, but it's not correct to say they're not the same in any sense. All right, so Lord willing, we'll start there. We'll start there next Sunday morning.